The grumbling of sunny meadows. The grumbling started before sunrise. It seeped from room 207 like a noxious gas, poisoning the otherwise serene atmosphere of Sunny Meadows' retirement home. It was Arthur Abernathy, of course. No one else could muster such a symphony of discontent before the first robin dared to chirp. "My head's pounding like a blacksmith's hammer," he'd moan to any nurse unlucky enough to draw the early morning shift. "And my memory's gone. Gone, I tell ya. I can't even remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. Probably gruel. They always serve gruel." Poor Mrs. Higgins, a gentle woman with perpetually tired eyes, would patiently pat his hand. Now, Mr. Abernathy, Dr. Thomas will be around shortly. He'll sort you out." Arthur would scoff, a sound like gravel grinding against bone. "Dr. Thomas thinks he knows everything, that one. Fresh out of medical school, probably. What does he know about a head that's seen 90 years of hard living?" Dr. Thomas Ashton, however, was not thinking about Arthur Abernathy at all. He was running late. Again. He had overslept, haunted by the ghost of a misdiagnosis from his residency. The weight of that error still pressed heavily on his conscience, a constant reminder of his fallibility. He rushed through the corridors of Sunny Meadows, his white coat flapping behind him like a distressed flag. He found Arthur in the communal dining room, poking listlessly at a plate of scrambled eggs. The grumbling, if anything, had intensified. "Right, Mr. Abernathy," Dr. Thomas said, his voice clipped. "What seems to be the problem today?" He barely paused for breath, already mentally running through his morning schedule. Arthur fixed him with a withering stare. "Besides being ancient and decrepit? My head. And my memory. I told those nurses." Dr. Thomas sighed inwardly. He hated these vague, age-related complaints. He quickly checked Arthur's vitals, a cursory examination at best. Blood pressure was slightly elevated, but nothing alarming. He shone a penlight in Arthur's eyes, then tapped his knees with a reflex hammer. "Everything seems normal, Mr. Abernathy," he declared, scribbling something illegible on his chart. "It's probably just senioritis." Arthur's eyebrows shot up. "Senioritis? What in blazes is senioritis?" Dr. Thomas offered a dismissive shrug. "You know, a general slowing down. Age-related cognitive decline. It's perfectly normal at your age." "Normal?" Arthur sputtered. "So you're saying it's normal for my head to feel like it's been used as a punching bag and for my memories to vanish like smoke?" "Essentially, yes," Dr. Thomas said, his gaze already drifting toward the door. "Try to get some rest, Mr. Abernathy. And perhaps avoid reading so much. Stimulating the brain too much can lead to headaches." He escaped before Arthur could launch another tirade, leaving the old man muttering to himself about incompetent doctors and the general decline of society. Arthur watched him go, a spark of something unreadable flickering in his eyes. He knew his body was failing him. He felt it in the constant aches, the fleeting moments of disorientation. But he also knew there was something more than senioritis at play. Something he couldn't quite grasp, something buried deep within the recesses of his fading memory. And he wouldn't rest until he figured it out, no matter how many dismissive young doctors tried to tell him it was all in his head. The eggs grew cold. The grumbling continued. 7 years later. The clinic's overhead lights buzzed, a mechanical lament that echoed the weariness entrenched deep within Thomas. 7 years. A full 7 years since he'd stepped into this cramped space, a greenhorn resident armed with textbook wisdom and a hubris he now recognized as pure, unadulterated arrogance. 7 years of battling infections and back pain, enduring flu seasons that blurred into one another, navigating the labyrinth of insurance claims and paperwork. He leafed through the next chart, barely registering the name, Arthur Pinter, 72. Complaint, joint pain, lassitude, generalized discomfort. He exhaled, a sigh heavy with routine. Another Tuesday, another patient swallowed by the insatiable maw of the healthcare system. Then, a spark. The faint ghost of an image flickered across the sterile white of the file, Mr. Abernathy. His face, a study in bewilderment and quiet desperation, a desperation Thomas had been too hurried, too callow, to truly acknowledge. "Just old age, Mr. Abernathy," he declared, patting the man's shoulder with a dismissive bonhomie that now curdled in his stomach. "Take it easy." The antiseptic tang of the office filled his memory, the clock's insistent tick, the defeated shuffle of Mr. Abernathy's retreating footsteps. Had he even bothered to run the proper diagnostic tests? Likely not. He'd been behind, pressured to maximize patient volume, to inflate billing hours. Thomas snapped the file closed. The familiar sting of guilt pricked him. In his eagerness to prove his mettle, to impress those above him, he had bartered away, what, exactly? Empathy? Thoroughness? The very principles he'd sworn to uphold? He massaged his temples, the throbbing escalating to a dull ache. He'd rationalized it countless times, he couldn't save them all, errors were unavoidable. But Mr. Abernathy's visage persisted, a constant, silent accusation. He checked the time. Another patient awaited. Another 15 minutes to diagnose, treat, and dispatch. He adjusted his tie, summoning a smile that felt more like a grimace. He was a doctor. He had a responsibility. But the weight of those 7 years, the accumulated burden of rushed assessments and overlooked signals, bore down on him, stifling. He retrieved Arthur Pinter's file, a renewed determination hardening his eyes. He wouldn't repeat the error. Not this time. He would attend. He would examine. He would perceive the individual before him, not just the symptoms outlined on a form. He activated the intercom. "Send in Mr. Pinter, please." As he waited, he accessed the clinic's updated blood test requisition form on his computer. He would request the comprehensive panel. He owed it to Mr. Pinter. He owed it to Mr. Abernathy. He owed it to himself. A hero's whisper. The overhead lights in examination room 3 hummed, a grating counterpoint to the anxiety churning in Thomas's gut. He was behind schedule, again. Arthur, bless his perpetually griping soul, had monopolized his time, and now Mrs. Gable was waiting. He pasted on his most reassuring smile as he entered, clipboard clutched in his hand. "Morning, Mrs. Gable. And how are we today?" Eleanor Gable, her face a roadmap of laughter rather than worry lines, returned his smile with genuine warmth. "Fit as a fiddle, doctor. Just a routine checkup, nothing to trouble you." Her voice, a soothing balm, washed over him. Thomas proceeded with the standard examination, stethoscope cool against her skin, reflexes tested. Mrs. Gable chatted on, her monologue filled with weather reports and enthusiastic accounts of the Sunny Meadows hydrangeas in full bloom. His attention was only half there, his mind already racing toward the mounting pressures awaiting him. Henderson's lab results demanded his immediate attention, and a veritable Everest of paperwork threatened to bury his desk. "Everything sounds good," he concluded, scribbling on her chart. "Continue the medication as prescribed." "Thank you, doctor." "You know," she hesitated, a playful glint in her eyes, "Sunny Meadows is quite the happening place these days. Such interesting characters." Thomas murmured an acknowledgement, his hand already on the doorknob. "We even have a bona fide hero in our midst." The word hit him like a speed bump. He pivoted back. "Oh? Really? Who's that?" He attempted nonchalance, but a spark of curiosity had been lit. "Ah, I wouldn't dream of spoiling the surprise," she chuckled, the sound rich and melodic. "But he's a modest one. Doesn't boast about his achievements." Thomas frowned. Sunny Meadows was hardly a hotbed of bravery or daring-do. It was mostly a haven for the elderly and infirm, Arthur being the irritating exception. "Anyone I know, perhaps," he persisted, an insistent itch beneath his skin. Mrs. Gable's gaze sharpened, holding an unspoken judgment. "Possibly. He's been a resident for a while." "A Mr. Arthur Penshaw." The name struck him like an unexpected blow. "Arthur? A hero?" His Arthur, the king of complaints regarding tasteless meals and window drafts. The notion seemed laughable, ludicrous. Arthur Penshaw? He mentions his aches and pains far more than any acts of valor. Thomas forced a laugh, its hollowness echoing in the confines of the room. Well, some heroes bear their scars internally, Mrs. Gable observed quietly, her eyes reflecting an enigmatic wisdom. Sometimes, the most courageous act is simply persevering. He swallowed, the air in the small space suddenly thick and constricting. The weight of past assumptions pressed upon him, a leaden burden. What kind of hero are we talking about? He needed to know. Was this simply Mrs. Gable's charming eccentricity, or was there a hidden dimension to Arthur beyond the cantankerous old codger he had treated for years? Mrs. Gable merely smiled, guarding her secret closely. That, Doctor, is for him to share. If he ever chooses to. She patted his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. You have a pleasant day now, Doctor. And show a little more kindness to Mr. Penshaw. He's earned it. Thomas stood rooted, the delicate scent of lavender lingering in the room long after she had departed. Arthur. A hero. The idea burrowed into his thoughts, a persistent puzzle he couldn't dismiss. He glanced at the clock. He was late, desperately so. But, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the packed schedule, the bureaucratic deluge, the endless demands seemed insignificant. He needed to speak to Arthur. He needed to uncover the truth. Unexpected reunion. The scent of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee hung heavy in the air as Dr. Thomas Ashton rushed through the automatic doors of Sunny Meadows Assisted Living. He was already 20 minutes behind schedule, and Mrs. Gable's insistence on a face-to-face about her digestive concerns wasn't exactly raising his spirits. He tugged at the collar of his perpetually wrinkled shirt, a nervous habit he hadn't shaken since med school. He found her in the sunroom, a bright space filled with wicker furniture and the cheerful chirping of unseen birds. But she wasn't alone. Arthur Abernathy sat across from her, his brow furrowed as he listened intently. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting long shadows that stretched across the patterned rug. Mrs. Gable's face lit up as she saw him. Dr. Ashton, perfect timing. Arthur and I were just having a lovely chat. Abernathy looked up, his expression shifting from thoughtful to something less friendly. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a flicker of resentment. Doctor, Abernathy said, his voice raspy. He didn't rise, didn't offer a hand. Just a curt nod. Thomas forced a smile, acutely aware of the awkwardness radiating from the small circle. Mr. Abernathy. Fancy seeing you here. He immediately regretted the flippant tone. Mrs. Gable, bless her heart, seemed oblivious. Arthur was just telling me about his experiences overseas. She beamed. Quite the adventurer, he is. Thomas's mental gears shifted. Overseas? The Abernathy he knew only complained about the early bird specials at the diner and the volume of the television in the common room. He dismissed Abernathy's increasingly frequent complaints of headaches and memory lapses as senioritis, nothing a little extra hydration and mental stimulation couldn't fix. Now, looking at the man, the lines etched deeper in his face than he remembered, he felt a prickle of, what? Guilt? Curiosity? Really? Thomas said, trying to sound genuinely interested. I wasn't aware you'd traveled much, Mr. Abernathy. Abernathy's gaze narrowed. There's a lot you aren't aware of, Doctor. The air crackled with unspoken accusation. He shifted in his chair, a wince briefly crossing his face. Head's been pounding something awful today. Thomas hesitated. He had a stack of patient files waiting for him back at the office, a overflowing inbox, and Mrs. Gable's digestive concerns. But something in Abernathy's eyes, a plea hidden beneath the gruff exterior, stopped him. He pulled up a chair, ignoring the stab of guilt he felt at the thought of his mounting schedule. Tell me about it, Mr. Abernathy. When did the headaches start? He glanced at Mrs. Gable. Perhaps we can continue this another time. Mrs. Gable, ever perceptive, nodded understandingly. Of course, Doctor. Arthur needs your attention. She patted Abernathy's arm. "You take care now, dear." As Mrs. Gable bustled away, leaving them alone in the sun-drenched room, Thomas focused his attention on the old man. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Arthur Abernathy than met his dismissive eye. The faded photograph. "Arthur, dear, you'll catch a chill," Mrs. Gable's voice, laced with gentle concern, floated from the doorway. Dr. Thomas Ashton, perpetually running late, nearly tripped over the welcome mat, his briefcase thumping against his leg. He mumbled an apology, the scent of brewing chamomile tea filling his nostrils. Abernathy stood stiffly on the porch, his gaze fixed on the grey expanse of the autumn sky. He didn't acknowledge Thomas's arrival. "He's been like this all morning," Mrs. Gable confided, her voice barely a whisper as she led Thomas inside. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of a table lamp, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Abernathy remained outside, a solitary figure silhouetted against the muted light. "Headache, I presume?" Thomas asked, already reaching for his bag. He felt a familiar pang of guilt, another rushed visit, another set of perfunctory questions. "Worse than usual, he says. And his memory, it's been particularly bad today." She wrung her hands, her knuckles white. "He kept calling me Martha earlier." Thomas sighed inwardly. This was getting harder. He needed to spend more time, dig deeper, but the clinic demanded his attention. He cleared his throat. Perhaps a change of scenery would do him good. A walk in the park, maybe. Mrs. Gable smiled faintly. "I suggested that." He refused. Stubborn as an old mule, that one. She chuckled, a sound that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was just showing Thomas some old photographs, Arthur," she called out to the porch. "Maybe that will jog your memory." Abernathy grunted, a non-committal sound that could have meant anything. Mrs. Gable shuffled through a stack of faded albums on the coffee table. She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a particularly worn leather cover. "Ah, here we are." She extracted a small, sepia-toned photograph and handed it to Thomas. "This was taken just before Arthur went off to war," she said, her voice softening. Thomas took the photograph, expecting a blurry snapshot of a young man in civilian clothes. Instead, he stared at a crisp image of a soldier in a perfectly pressed uniform. The man in the photograph was impossibly young, barely more than a boy, his face lean and resolute. He stood ramrod straight, his eyes fixed on some distant horizon, a hint of defiance in his jaw. It was Abernathy, unmistakably, but different. The years had etched lines of weariness and resentment on his face, obscuring the youthful idealism captured in the photograph. Thomas felt a jolt, a sudden, unexpected wave of, what? Recognition? Disbelief? This man, the stooped, forgetful old man he treated every week, had been a soldier. A young man facing the horrors of war? He looked up at Mrs. Gable, his mouth agape. Arthur was in the war. Her smile faltered. "Well, yes, of course. Didn't he tell you?" She seemed surprised, almost embarrassed. "He doesn't usually talk about it." Abernathy shuffled in from the porch, his eyes narrowed. "What's all the fuss?" He rasped, his gaze fixed on the photograph in Thomas's hand. A flicker of something, anger? Crossed his face before it was quickly masked. Thomas swallowed hard, his mind racing. 7 years. 7 years of treating Abernathy, and he hadn't known this? Hadn't asked the right questions? The implications were staggering. Could this explain his memory lapses, his headaches? Was this the key to unlocking the mystery of Arthur Abernathy? "Just admiring your youthful vigor, Arthur," Thomas said, forcing a smile. He handed the photograph back to Mrs. Gable, his fingers trembling slightly. He knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in his gut, that he had just stumbled upon something significant. Something he couldn't ignore. Unearthing the truth. The acrid taste of institutional coffee lingered on Thomas's tongue, a bitter prelude to the day. Sleep had offered no respite, Mr. Abernathy's bewildered expression a persistent shadow behind his closed lids. For 7 years, he'd managed Abernathy's ailments, dispensed medication, and yet remained fundamentally ignorant of the man before him. Guilt, sharp and insistent, pricked at his conscience. He abandoned the tepid brew and swung his chair to face the computer screen. He needed insight, a portrait beyond the medical chart. He typed Arthur Abernathy, adding the military service almost as an afterthought, expecting scant results. Abernathy had always been reticent, dismissing his past with a vague murmur about things best left forgotten. What surfaced was astounding, a cascade of articles chronicling extraordinary acts of courage. Citations for Valor, a digitized silver star blazing on the monitor. Thomas scrolled, his surprise deepening. Abernathy, the quiet, stooped figure from his monthly appointments, had been a hero. A grainy newspaper image materialized, a younger Abernathy, strikingly handsome, eyes blazing with determination, accepting an honor. The caption detailed a daring rescue, extracting wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle amidst intense enemy fire. A coldness settled in Thomas's gut. How could he have missed this? Digging further, he refined his search with injury. Then he found it, a terse notation in an after-action report. Abernathy, A. Sustained head trauma during explosion. Severity, significant. Significant. The word resonated with unspoken weight. Another article, pulled from a medical journal, outlined the long-term consequences of traumatic brain injuries, memory impairment, personality shifts, diminished focus. The symptoms aligned eerily with Abernathy's condition. A wave of faintness swept over Thomas. He had been so quick to attribute Abernathy's cognitive decline to the simplicities of age, so eager to adhere to the relentless schedule. He had overlooked a deeper, more profound explanation. He leaned back, the hum of the fluorescent lights a grating counterpoint to his thoughts. He pictured Abernathy's face, the fleeting confusion in his gaze, the halting cadence of his speech. It wasn't simply the passage of time. It was a war injury, a silent struggle raging within the confines of his mind. A stab of remorse pierced him. He, the physician, the supposed alleviator of suffering, had failed to perceive the pain masked by routine. He had treated the symptoms, not the individual. He closed his eyes, imagining Abernathy in his hospital bed, his fragile frame a stark contrast to the vibrant, fearless soldier he had just witnessed. He had to rise to the occasion. He had to truly understand. He had to atone. Opening his eyes, a new determination solidified within him. He would consult specialists, order exhaustive tests. He would listen intently, absorbing every detail Abernathy offered. He owed him nothing less. He began jotting notes, already formulating plans for the next appointment, now armed with knowledge and a newfound humility. The stale coffee, somehow, had lost some of its edge. A doctor's regret. The downpour lashed his study windows, a percussive barrage that echoed the pulse hammering behind Thomas's eyes. Sleep had eluded him for days. Mr. Abernathy's careworn visage, etched with a fatigue that transcended mere aging, seared itself onto his inner vision. He agitated the amber liquid in his tumbler, the scotch offering scant solace against the rising tide of unease within. He'd been too swift, too streamlined, shepherding Mr. Abernathy through the bureaucratic maze like a defective component. Another aging patient with complaints easily written off as the ravages of time. Osteoarthritis, he'd pronounced, scratching out a prescription with scarcely a glance. Take these, and endeavor to remain active. Active. The suggestion tasted like bile. What activity remained when the body itself turned traitor, each movement a hushed lament of pain? He recalled the subtle favor Mr. Abernathy afforded his left side, a nearly imperceptible hitch he'd summarily dismissed. He remembered the man's guarded responses, the averted gaze when questioned about his history. Then, a memory jolted him, sudden and sharp. A faint annotation on Mr. Abernathy's chart, barely discernible, war-wound, shrapnel, left leg. A glacial dread gripped Thomas. Shrapnel. Not mere arthritis. He shoved away from the desk, the chair screeching against the hardwood. He began to roam, the planks creaking underfoot. So engrossed in metrics, quotas, and the relentless influx of patients, he'd ceased to perceive the individuals before him. He'd ceased to truly hear. The rain intensified, mirroring the storm raging within. He now envisioned Mr. Abernathy not as a mere data point, but as a person, a veteran, a living soul deserving of consideration, attention, respect. A man who'd served his nation only to be brushed aside by the very institution he'd defended. He halted, his palm pressed against the window's cold surface. The rain dissolved the city lights into a blurred, nebulous glow. He'd erred, grievously. And he understood, with a certainty that struck marrow deep, that he must rectify it. He would no longer be the hasty, impersonal physician. He would attend, he would scrutinize, he would seek understanding. He would delve into Mr. Abernathy's past, connecting the pieces he had so carelessly overlooked. He would unearth the truth, even if it challenged his initial assessment. He inhaled deeply, the air thick with petrichor and the aroma of scotch. He drained his glass in one swallow, the liquor searing its way down. It wouldn't undo his error, but it would galvanize his determination. Tomorrow, he would contact Mr. Abernathy. He would offer amends. He would begin anew. He owed him that. He owed himself that. The rain persisted, a cathartic cascade erasing the vestiges of his indifference, leaving behind a fervent yearning to atone. Second chance. The weight of Abernathy's stoic figure on the porch pressed down on Thomas. He was seeing the man anew, not as a scheduled patient, a billable code. Now, the veteran's guarded demeanor felt like a personal rebuke. Thomas realized his debt extended beyond a cursory exam and prescription. He owed Abernathy genuine consideration. The following days became a whirlwind of research and consultations. The hospital library became his refuge as he devoured articles about head trauma, PTSD, and the lingering effects of combat. He buttonholed neurologists in the cafeteria, sketching Abernathy's constellation of symptoms on napkins, a tireless pursuit driven by his growing sense of remorse. Swallowing his professional ego, he even contacted Dr. Eleanor Vance, a specialist in age-related cognitive decline, whose incisive observations proved invaluable. He began to recognize subtle clues he'd missed, nuances lost in the brevity of prior appointments. At last, a coherent theory began to emerge. Abernathy's throbbing headaches, the frustrating memory blanks, the disorienting episodes, these weren't simply the expected consequences of aging. They were echoes of a past trauma, reverberating through the years, amplified by insufficient care. He found Abernathy on the porch again, standing stiffly, his gaze fixed on some unseen horizon. Thomas inhaled deeply. "Mr. Abernathy," he began, carefully measuring his words. "I've been digging deeper into your case, examining it from different angles. I believe we're closer to understanding what's happening." Abernathy's eyes darted, settling on Thomas with a wary glint. "Another label, Doc? Another handful of pills?" "Not quite," Thomas replied, drawing up a chair. He elucidated his hypothesis, emphasizing the potential link between Abernathy's current ailments and his wartime experiences. He spoke with deliberate slowness and patience, eschewing complex medical terminology. He proposed a novel approach, physical therapy to address his stiff joints, medication to alleviate the headaches, and, most critically, sessions with a therapist specializing in the treatment of PTSD. Abernathy remained impassive, his features an inscrutable mask. When Thomas finished, he stated simply, "War's ancient history, document buried it all." "Sometimes, what's buried deep still festers," Thomas countered gently. "This isn't about exhuming the past, Mr. Abernathy. It's about empowering you to live more fully today." Abernathy shuffled, a spark of something akin to hope flickering across his face. "Therapy, eh? Never cotton to spilling my guts." "It's more than just talking," Thomas assured him. "It's about developing constructive coping strategies, learning to navigate the anxiety and the discomfort." He paused, letting his words sink in. "It's about offering yourself the chance at a richer, more fulfilling life." The old man pondered this, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "A new lease on life, you reckon?" "I do," Thomas responded, meeting Abernathy's gaze directly, his voice filled with conviction. I genuinely do. Abernathy offered no immediate reply, but following a protracted, weighty silence, he nodded slowly. All right, Doc, he conceded, his voice gravelly. All right. Let's give it a whirl. The wariness lingered in his eyes, but a fragile tendril of trust had begun to unfurl. It was a tentative beginning. A hero remembered. The furrows in Mr. Abernathy's face seemed to have softened, like plowed earth after a spring rain. Not exactly mirthful, he was, but the habitual set of his jaw had relaxed its grip. Headaches visited less frequently, and the fogs of disorientation thinned. Each morning, he still stood rigid on the porch, a weathered sentinel scanning for unseen threats, but sometimes, Dr. Thomas observed, a fleeting, almost spectral smile graced his lips as a robin pecked at the feeder. Eleanor Gable, with her keen eye, corroborated the positive shift. He's resting easier, Doctor. And recalling events from years ago. Those reminiscences were the linchpin. Dr. Thomas had begun to truly listen, not just register complaints. He lingered during his visits, silencing the insistent buzz of his schedule, simply keeping Mr. Abernathy company. He discovered a passion for vegetable gardening, memories of his departed wife Martha, and, slowly, reluctantly, stories of the war. An idea began to take root. He approached Mrs. Gable. I was thinking, perhaps a small acknowledgement, here at Sunny Meadows. To honor Mr. Abernathy's service. Eleanor's face brightened. Oh, Doctor, what a lovely thought. The occasion was modest. A handful of residents, several staff members, and an American flag, courtesy of the local VFW. Mr. Abernathy, in a borrowed suit that swam slightly on his frame, stood stiffly as Dr. Thomas addressed the assembly. We often overlook, Dr. Thomas began, his voice amplified by a small microphone, the sacrifices borne by those who served. Mr. Abernathy is one such individual. He served with valor in the Pacific Theater, confronting unspeakable horrors. He paused, casting a glance at Mr. Abernathy, who remained inscrutable. Mr. Abernathy, would you care to share a few words? A hush descended upon the group. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, his gaze locked on the stars and stripes. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, before he spoke, his voice a dry rustle. He spoke of the oppressive heat, the ever-present dampness, the gnawing fear that shadowed his every waking moment. He spoke of the young faces of his comrades, brimming with hope, many of whom never saw home again. He recounted battles waged, victories wrested at a terrible cost, and the haunted expressions of the enemy. He spoke of experiences buried for 7 decades. As he spoke, his bearing seemed to yield. The taut line of his shoulders loosened. The clench in his jaw relaxed. He was no longer a frail old man struggling with his thoughts, but a soldier, a survivor, a hero acknowledged. When he concluded, a wave of applause rippled through the crowd. A few residents dabbed at tear-filled eyes. Dr. Thomas felt a knot form in his own throat. Afterward, Mr. Abernathy sat on the porch, the center of a small circle of well-wishers. Eleanor Gable offered him tea and a plate of cookies. He even smiled, a warm, authentic smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Later, as Dr. Thomas drove home, he replayed the day's events. He considered Mr. Abernathy, the stories unearthed, the newfound tranquility that seemed to envelop him. He recalled Eleanor Gable's unwavering kindness. He also couldn't help but dwell on his own shortcomings. How easily he had dismissed Mr. Abernathy's concerns, how readily he had jumped to conclusions, how little effort he had invested in understanding the man beyond the symptoms. He was a physician, dedicated to healing, yet he had almost overlooked the deepest wound of all, the one carved by time and trauma. He had absorbed a profound lesson, one that extended far beyond textbooks and trials. He had grasped the power of empathy, of truly listening, of recognizing the person, not merely a catalogue of ailments. He had discovered that sometimes, the most potent remedy is simply presence. The weight on his shoulders, the burden of guilt that had plagued him, felt noticeably lighter. He still had much to learn, but he was finally moving in the right direction.